people need to do work, right? I don't know about the word initiated, but they're going to have to technically go through different stages of awareness and knowledge and cultivation. And if they skip those steps, that's as much a problem as if they never had that knowledge to begin with, right? They just fall into this abyss of introspection and they just become totally useless and non-functional, right? And just fall into like actually into real mystery cults, right? They fall into a QAnon conspiracy or they join a Scientology cult. That also happens if you, bite off more than you can chew.
It's an oft-cited thing, but you can't run until you walk. I don't know of a single instance of a baby that just began running before crawling and walking. So you have to go through, again, certain benchmarks where you wouldn't want your surgeon to start doing work on your heart or some serious issue if they haven't learned the basics of anatomy, right? It's just the way things are. So the question is just, how can you have knowledge or a society organized around the pursuit of knowledge in a way which is disciplined and encourages a leaning into the unknown with the faith that we can discover how to deal with that unknown space that we are leaning into as we search to make a discovery of something we've never known before, right? A discovery by its nature is of something that you have never experienced before. Hey, everybody. So welcome to this week's Sunday lecture. It's not really a lecture. This is going to be a little bit different. We actually had a cancellation and I needed somebody last minute again. Dave has been working on something pretty special over the past several months and said he could fill in as long as it doesn't quite fit the usual topics. So we already set we created a new standard, a new experiment a couple of weeks ago when Jay Davies presented a short film that he had been working on, which is not yet released. So everybody who is privy to these meetings got access to his incredible work on the New Age roots, the theosophical roots of the United Nations, of right-wing fascism, and the whole gamut, with a fun conversation that we had centered around that video. Today, we're going to get a sample yet again of something similar where David has been working now for some time on the topic of the mysteries and these esoteric orders that have been sort of bubbling under the surface, shaping things, misshaping things might be the proper word for it, for far too long. And the mystique of it all has created a big place in people's wild imagination to think that maybe our problems are caused by the fact that those ne'er-do-wells that have been holding on like parasites to human civilization truly do have truly supernatural powers that give them this capacity to have just a few of them lord over the many. And that whether it's the channeling of extraterrestrial forces or demonic forces or whatever, I think we fall into a trap when we assume too much of this thing, that we assume that they have too many capabilities. And I think that that certain agencies that want to enslave us enjoy the idea that their desired slaves think that their wannabe masters really are supernatural beyond reproach. And so why even bother resisting when you're just a mere mortal? You don't have superpowers. Why? You're not channeling the powers of demons and whatever beyond. Why even bother resisting? Says the duped fool. And too many people today, I think, are wearing the duped fool cap right now, playing into this. And David he wrote a book on slaying Mithra, which is available in the description box under this video. And his new film that he's working on, it will be released soon. We here today are going to see the first draft of it. It won't be available when I make this video public, because we're going to have a conversation with Dave after this thing is finished playing. It's maybe 30 minutes. And when I make this available, the film that we're going to watch won't be there. So I'm just going to tell people will only get access to the conversation. And then probably in the coming weeks, Dave will release the full draft. So without further ado, I'm going to open up for Dave to say a few opening remarks before we watch the video and then transition into a dialogue with the filmmaker himself. So, David, thank you for doing this.
All right, thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. So yeah, this is a big project, and it's very timely, as I think people will see once they get a glimpse of the film. But yeah, I think Matt, you kind of hit it on the head there with all the kind of very unhealthy and toxic ways that people are spiritualizing the current events unfolding. You know, we are in a new age of tribulations, you could say. But what exactly is the cause? You know, and how do we wrestle with these problems and the solutions? I mean, people are spiritualizing what's going on for all the wrong reasons. And it's really inducing a kind of psychic break in a lot of people, right? Because they're not able to really think about things in a way that makes sense, right? There's a lot of like revelation and end time stuff, and people are just kind of going to the worst places spiritually to kind of make sense and cope with the current situation. So in any time like this, right, I think we need to zoom out, right? We need to take a step back here. And in this case, because there is a spiritual dimension to all this, but again, what does that mean? I think the most important thing to do would be to go back way to the beginning. Actually, let's start from the beginning, uh, which means the original mysteries, right? The ancient mysteries. We're talking about mystery cults and how, you know, different people have been getting different kinds of education, and it's been causing them to think in different ways that are not necessarily aligned with reality, or you know, that create completely new realities that, if anything, are just you know, throwing them deeper into a spiritual dark age, if you will, where yeah, the only way out is to fight, you know, evil spiritual forces with supposedly good spiritual forces. But then when you hear how people are thinking about that, the good spiritual forces are kind of, it's, you know, it's fight fire with fire. So that's a problem. And so I think, yeah, we can start the film, and there are a lot of twists and turns. There are a lot of crests and valleys in this production. It's a long-term project. There's going to be more films, more spin-offs from this. But I think this is a good taste of the conversation that we should be having, and, you know, being able to bridge the ancient spiritual war with our modern world and how that translates into the modern world in a modern setting. I think this is where most people, that's where there's a psychic break. They're not really able to bridge the ancient and the modern world. The world is still full of mysteries, you know, but what are the real mysteries, and what are the deceptions that are being presented as new revelations? So yeah, I said, Matt, take it away. We'll start the film, and there's a gap near the end. We're not going to play till the end, but we're going to go pretty far. And like Matt said, if anything, we're just gonna, for the public showing, we're gonna clip part of that film out, and we'll have some of it, and then we'll have the discussion, and then we're gonna have a big launch. This is the first part. Second part will follow shortly after the first part drops to the public. So yeah, there's a lot coming. So here's part one.
Western civilization was built on mysteries. but what lies behind them. From the mysteries of ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, to the later order of the Rosicrucians, Freemasonic organizations, and the many occult societies that have flourished in their wake. Behind the official story of Western civilization lies its many mysteries. Perhaps most mysterious of all, however, is the mystery of Babylon. One of the oldest recorded civilizations, its legacy has survived across the ages through its many incarnations, the many empires sprung from its loins, carrying on its legacy and mystery. Indeed, the mystery of Babylon is all around us. But what happens when we lift the veil? What do we actually find? What finds us? Is it possible to venture into this world without getting lost? After all, historically, civilization's deepest mysteries have been guarded by its most adept, its priests, its poets, its statesmen, and sages. And historically, a society's most sacred knowledge was preserved through these mysteries. From creation myths to sacred stories, its gods, and the innermost knowledge of man himself, one encountered the very image of man, the mystery that is man, which shaped the world at its deepest spiritual and psychological level. Those who controlled this sacred knowledge ultimately determined man's understanding of himself, his fate, his lot, his place, his purpose. But while such knowledge was often guarded by society's most adept and cultivated minds, power over society's sacred myths and images hasn't always fallen into the right hands. Such power could be used to conceal civilization's most sacred knowledge in order to better preserve it, or it could be used to suppress it, to conceal it, in order to better control such knowledge. Indeed, many of Plato's most ambitious works, including the Republic and the Laws, dedicated large swaths of their expositions to determining which images of man should rule, who should determine these images, and which mysteries and allegories were most suitable to preserving these truths. While the modern mind believes everything true is explicable, since time immemorial, wise men have known that at the heart of every great truth lies a mystery. Just as behind every man, there lies a soul. Behind every veil, a visage. And behind every symbol, a meaning. Whether the real mysteries of Western civilization can ever be fully reclaimed remains up for debate. What is certain is that if its deepest truths are to be unveiled, we must first come face to face with that Scarlet Woman. Said otherwise, the only way out of Babylon is through Babylon.
So yeah, that's just the beginning. So this is just the beginning of the journey, but I feel like just there are so many parallels that we can draw with our modern world in terms of sort of untangling some of these Gordian knots, whether it's about the role of sacred knowledge, or like what's really controlling today's marcher lord, right? Geopolitically, people seem to not, they seem to have a lot of trouble with that, right? And identifying who are actually the bad actors. And I was just thinking as I was watching, even a parallel, the idea of there being sacred knowledge or certain ideas that people should have to work for to sort of access, that we see what's happened with like the Q-tard phenomena, and like people's brains just melting when they learn certain things about the world because they had been so sheltered for so long, living kind of normie lives, and there was abundance and everything was great. And when cracks appear in that illusion, it's really overwhelming for people that are so deeply anchored in our current reality. So is the move to just dump everything on people and blow their minds? And I feel a more, my youthful self was like, that's always, you just want to drop bombs, right? But the idea of there having to be certain kinds of initiation, and not in a secret, not in like a theosophist way, but you have to earn knowledge and wisdom is something that's earned. So the idea that people are just going to be given things and know what to do with it, or that something that is good might actually do harm if it's not delivered at the right time. There's many things that children, that are realities and facts of life, but it doesn't mean you don't just tell Timmy at like 4 years old that he's going to die in X amount of years, and his mom's going to die, and his dad's going to die, and his dog's going to die really soon, actually. So he better make the best of it, or it's not going to help him. He's not. Uh, Also, just so there is this kind of need for initiation or work, right? But that there's a difference between guarding secret knowledge and having a methodology. Methodology is something that has to be developed and cultivated so that you can resolve paradoxes and you can figure out big problems, versus the idea of just concealing things and sort of guarding certain knowledge and just using symbols and kind of manipulating people, and doing what you want with that knowledge, right, of how the world works and how things work. So people will tend to think that, oh, so like all mysteries or sacred knowledge, it's all just this theosophical or devilish conspiracy. It's all bad. And I think about the way people think about government, right? This mystery cults have done all this bad, therefore they must all be bad, and it's all been bad forever, and there's never been anything good or sacred that had to be guarded or preserved. Same things with nation states, right? Governments are bad. Look at all the bad things governments are done. We're better off just getting rid of governments, right? So something has done a lot of bad, but so that you're like, we have to get rid of it. There's a total lack of discernment there, right? In knowing what's what. And that's why I think that's why you do need these kind of, people need to do work, right? I don't know about the word initiated, but they're going to have to technically go through different stages of awareness and knowledge and cultivation. And if they skip those steps, that's as much a problem as if they never had that knowledge to begin with, right? They just fall into this abyss of introspection, and they just become totally useless and non-functional, right? And just fall into like, actually into real mystery cults, right? They fall into a QAnon conspiracy, or they join a Scientology cult. That also happens if you bite off more than you can chew. So yeah, that's why I think
Yeah.
this series is important, because we want to now develop people's palettes and abilities to wrestle with the real mysteries, which are necessary if we're to understand the actual spiritual and epistemological and psychological wars that are currently unfolding and that are causing a lot of psychic breaks in people today.
Very well said, Dave. No, I'm really looking forward to this film. I saw it in an earlier draft, and the updates that you did are just incredible. And this is very, very good. And the what you said as well, pertaining to like a healthy initiation, if you think about it, like that's kind of how we all live our lives according to an idea that you need to build capacities in order to have further, like you can't, it's an oft-cited thing, but you can't run until you walk. I don't know of a single instance of a baby that just began running before crawling and walking. So you have to go through like, again, certain benchmarks where you wouldn't want your surgeon to start doing work on your heart or some serious issue if they haven't learned the basics of anatomy, right? It's just the way things are. So the question is just how can you have knowledge or a society organized around the pursuit of knowledge in a way which is disciplined and encourages a leaning into the unknown with the faith that we can discover how to deal with that unknown space that we are leaning into as we search to make a discovery of something we've never known before, right? A discovery by its nature is of something that you have never experienced before. So you have to have confidence, self-esteem, a good guide as well, good teachers who can help pose the right questions to the student so that they know how to develop the skill sets to be able to answer them and qualify themselves to learn how to wield the power that knowledge, entails in a way that actually makes life better for people and for themselves and less for the oligarchy, for that very oligarchy you've so eloquently exposed as far as their less the personalities and more the essence of the thing itself. So that's really good, Dave. I noticed that Bruce has had his digital hand up for a bit, and I'm curious to see what Bruce thinks. Hey, Bruce.
Hello, thank you. David, I really enjoyed every minute of that. I wish it was just, 12 or 14 hours long as it unfolds. And I was very, very gratified by a major point toward the latter part of it, which is such a major part of my contemplation of the nature of reality, which is that this is a thoroughly spiritual realm, really alluded to by what you found and shared about the words describing the divinity. I am that I am what is. And I do believe it's very consistent with the impression that that is what is hidden by those who want to abuse and exploit others, is that we all have that ability to imagine that kind of reality. And I'm going to say power, which is dicey because the power to what? I'm at the age where it's just the power to enjoy life and existence, but it is the power of how we see things influences what things become to us, and that's the mystery of, I guess, consciousness and perception. But that was such a gratifying experience. Throughout it, I was hoping or imagining that there'd be some kind of written companion that footnotes just the sources, just because I like to see those kind of things. And yeah, congratulations. What are your thoughts about anything I may have said?
The journey's just beginning. So yeah, hopefully we can go on for 12 hours of, well, we could go on for 1,000 hours of material. That will require resources and time on my part. But it's actually, technically, that's kind of what needs to happen, right? Yeah, I think oftentimes as well, any kind of like renaissance or revival or rediscovery of the real thing starts with kind of going back to basics, right? So that's partly why I think this is useful. We're really going back to the basics and the beginning of Western civilization and reacquainting ourselves with the original mysteries, which kind of I mean, we can meditate on these things all day, right? They kind of seem simple, and in a certain sense they are, but there's a difference between, the idea of something being simple but kind of unbounded and infinite in terms of where you can go with it and where it can take you, and something that is just kind of limited for, lack of, there's the lack of the epistemological development, or conceptually the concept is kind of, it's missing something. So yeah, I do think that these are things we want to meditate on, but there's an effect, right? When we do, like, we can come back to the real world, we can come back to the way our interactions with people, with ourselves change, right? So there is something substantial from a seemingly kind of, immaterial or kind of very unpractical thing or idea. And I do think that people need to be grounded at this point, right? And that's also what, having a spiritual sort of life and journey is about, is to be grounded, right? It's not just to take off into hyperspace and party with the elves, but it really is about kind of coming back into our reality, and being more present, if anything, so that we can actually engage with people, engage with ourselves, and our we find that we can always just keep going deeper. So it's only increasing our hunger, right, and desire to go deeper and pursue the mysteries further. So I think that's always a good sign, right? If it's taking us in that way, and it's allowing us to gain new insights into reality, into the way the world works, into the way our minds work, into the way, other people's minds work,
What are
and
your
being
what
able.
what are your thoughts about the idea that the simple but enormous and profound idea that life is completely spiritual? There's one thing, essence, consciousness, that is appearing to itself as all of us and all individuals, and that is uh, fraught with the challenge of perceiving ourselves to be in competition with everything else that exists. But the truth that sets us free is this is something of an illusion. There is just this one essence, and the idea that that is what is hidden by those who would accrue and abuse power over others to make their victims and whole societies think you are just your material resources, and you need to fear those who've got more money and guns than you. And when a child is ready to ask what happens when we die or this and the other, it's to walk them into this idea that everything is what you think it is, and life is as kind and as loving as you are to yourself, with every thought and everyone around you. You only have what you give. What do you think about that as a possible thesis for reality, David?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say, in terms of, I feel like different people, like, sure, at a certain level, absolutely, but then, this is where, actually, this thing is going to go in all sorts of places, in terms, they're like, we're just getting started, right? But people, if you we were talking about Professor Zhang before. I'm a bit of a segue, but not really. I feel it's necessary. Who's talking about this kind of, I don't know if people saw this, but there was a clip about, like, what's his spiritual take or whatnot. And he gave a little critique of kind of institutional religion, or kind of any kind of organized religion. And he, believes, he's talking about consciousness. The true wealth is consciousness. And, he believes that everybody can kind of, meet God, come to an encounter with God in their own hearts. They don't really need other people or institutions to tell them to how to go about that. And one of the thoughts I had, though, because he is a Gnostic, right, and he's ultimately preaching this kind of Gnostic gospel, which says that everyone is just following their own individual kind of spiritual journey. In a sense, that's true, but in another sense, the reality is the Gnostic world is full of gurus. it's full of influencers. It's much like the media or the alt media, where there are all these supposedly independent operators and people, but there's a whole superstructure behind that that's actually very coordinated, much like the temples, right? These ancient temples, Apollo, Marduk. So people have the illusion that they're on their own spiritual journey. But if you just give that to people, people will do all sorts of different things with it. They will still join a sex cult and like a Manson thing, and they could say the same thing to themselves. So in to a certain sense, you're not wrong, but then we also know that how that can be abused, or what people will take from that, is very different. And so like I think that's why there needs to be this kind of spiritual, epistemological, psychological, intellectual development, because people will do different things with that based on where they're at. And we do need to meet people where they're at, but we also, I think the real spiritual journey is to constantly be challenged as well. Like I once had I used to consult for a while with an old little mystic Catholic lady, and she's very different from most people you hear talk about spirituality and stuff. And she said that a relationship with God is just like any other relationship. If it's not developing, it's going to deteriorate. So any relationships we have with people or whatnot, if they're not developing and they become static, they usually go in the opposite direction. And so there does need to be development. And development isn't something like, people can have very different ideas of that, right? But I do think there are some objective sort of ways to go about it. But yeah, it all ultimately is kind of, we have to be self-reflexive and hold ourselves to a certain standard, and yeah, not lie to ourselves, right? Like some of these things are very basic. I feel like a lot of people are just kind of lying to themselves today when you see how they're coping with reality, or what they think the spiritual war is about and what their place in it is. Most of it is copes. It's not serious, and they're not going in a direction that's going to allow them to develop further, right? They're just doubling down on kind of, whether it's end time stuff or whether it's like Hollywood good guys, bad guys. No matter how many war crimes, they're like, no, we're the good guys. That's okay.
Yeah.
Children have always, war has casualties, but they're not. So yeah, that's what I would say. Like
Thank
we do
you.
need to
Yeah.
go further, therefore. Like that's the purpose of this series, so that we really do flesh out the real history of these things, how the Western sort of spiritual and intellectual and political, geopolitical currents have developed. That's something that will ground us as we, continue to go deeper in our own sort of personal journeys. I think they're
And
connected.
yeah, and all that, and just to conclude, another huge value of your piece, and also all these experiences, Matt, it's to just see illusions, let alone descriptions of history beyond the very, very narrow constraints of official history, just unshackles me when I'm so bored by the official stories that are trying to force me to look at things in a certain way. This is all we've ever been. This is all we've ever done. This is all humans are capable of, and it's just such a straitjacket. So it's just so refreshing to realize I know nothing. I know a tiny fraction of what may have ever existed in the past. It's just so liberating and just so great. Thank you.
Amen. I agree.
Amen. Yeah, and like Socrates said, it's a real blessing to be able to just become self-aware of the this of what you thought you knew that you don't know, and also to appreciate, even though it may be little compared to what you knew when we were ignorant. We thought we knew more than we did. When we got knowledge, we realized what we thought we knew was actually less than what we actually know. But you appreciate what you know that much more, even though it's
Right.
small. You're like, wow, this is sacred stuff. I got to protect this with all my soul, the stuff that I've really earned, and try to increase the proportion of what I know to what I don't know with a good standard. So very few people can even say that cogently. And it gives you a lot to work with, which is why they despise Socrates. And Dave, what I really appreciated about your presentation is it made it more succinct in my mind. The this animus that this oligarchical system has towards ancient Greece and the legacy of Socrates and Plato and Xenophon. Because I had recalled the Ionian revolt against Persia, and I knew it was put down, and I knew it. I didn't really quite appreciate until I just saw this film you did that this oracular Marduk 2.0 Apollonian priesthood had a lot to do with that, and also why it was that Athens was successful in the Battle of Salamis. Was it Salamis? Yeah,
Salamis, yeah.
Salamis, sorry, in 480, uh, because they didn't listen to the advice of the oracles that were telling them to submit and don't really fight back. And I totally had blanked out on that fact, because there is something that in Greece has been incubating and as part of something probably much larger and older than Greece, but it became a conduit for this Sabellian, anti-oracular way of thinking about God, creation, the universe, and how that applies to us conducting our life in a more noble, dignified way. So really great stuff, man. I really appreciate that a lot. Are there any other examples that you could throw out of times when humanity disobeyed this priesthood that tried to get us to do something that wiser people said, no, rather not do
Well,
that?
technically that's, yeah, well, there's going to be more examples of that. And that's probably something we can continue to emphasize in further installments, even beyond this. Like this, what we saw here is about 10 pages of script. I have 25 pages of script, and the continuations are supposed to be a truth about Plato, 2 follow-ups, if not 3. I'll probably break it up into 2. And then, yeah, we can just technically there are more examples, and those are probably worth exploring right now. In the film, I mean, we're going to talk about Moses, and because that's also a moment that's very, shrouded in mystery and superstition, and yeah, that's probably, we're going to go deeper into Schiller's mission of Moses, but that's just going to set us up to then go into the Renaissance as well, where the same thing happened again, where a lot of the old ideas or the old ways of sort of corralling people, spiritually and otherwise, were kind of transcended, or a new approach was introduced, and that leads us to the modern world and the mystery of the modern world. And that's kind of where this series is going, because a lot of people feel that the modern world is just this totally soulless, technocratic, atheistic hellhole. But actually, what made the modern world possible, and when we contrast what became possible for just regular people, right, everyday people, in the modern world, in terms of potential, versus what was most people's lot under the rule of the mystery cults for thousands of years, there were some huge changes, right? And it also will probably highlight that, yeah, maybe many of us are not sort of reaching our full potential, but not in an Esalen kind of way. But yeah, there's a lot of mystery. The modern world is a very mysterious world. And if anything, yeah, they're hidden in plain sight. And people have just become kind of anesthetized by the kind of Brave New World system, that they've lost sight of a lot of the things that are kind of hidden in plain sight. And if we start to get back in touch with that, a whole new realm opens up again. And so, yeah, there's going to be a lot more twists and turns. There are definitely more moments of defying the gods, the priesthoods, and it's probably what needs to be done now, right? I mean, but people just, they're so people are very demoralized, and so until that changes, obviously they're just going to kind of double down. And I was listening to Tim Dillon, and he was just talking about like a lot of the spiritual conversations I'm hearing today, I decided to just write a little quip under a Twitter, something that popped up in my feed. And it was just, an Orthodox priest forecasting World War III. And obviously the guy's like, see, he said it, we're right, power of prophecy, this is going down. And then other people are arguing, well, no, it's not going to end times. It's probably going to be like 30 years after World War III. And it's like people love the revelation stuff. They're getting spiritual, but why do they like revelations? Because you don't have to do anything. It's just a showdown, right? It's punishment time, right? It's fire and brimstone. They're like the teachings of Jesus are like nobody's interested. When you hear the discourse, all these people that are talking about, Christianity and spiritual warfare, they are not interested in the idea of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself, or what these things actually translate to practically. Because if people did, we wouldn't be manipulated the way we are, right? The propaganda that's used to sort of weaponize people's emotions and create this kind of tribal warfare or civil war, and it wouldn't be possible if people actually observed the basic maxims. So that's why they like revelation, because you don't really have to do any of that. And it's very much, people think, well, I have this opinion, I have a correct opinion, I believe the right things, and all these other people, all my enemies, are going to get what's coming to them, right? And that makes them feel really good. So is that good, or are you evil if you think like that? Have you been conditioned to have you been recruited to something that is kind of cheering on the collapse? And yeah, they're accelerationists, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about a conversation that I had recently had with somebody who is they think of themselves as a Christian who adores Pete Hegseth, thinks he's a modicum of a Christian warrior moral spirit. And I brought to their attention the fact that he gave a speech where he's literally saying that we're going to rain down fire and death without mercy onto Iran. And I mean, isn't mercy like the principle of Jesus's teaching and loving your enemy and turning the other cheek? And you're saying that because at the end of the day, what he's doing is, in their minds, like you just said, ushering or accelerating what they want, which is prophecy to be fulfilled, justice to destroy the enemies, whoever they've been told their enemies are, and no mercy. So I mean, yeah, like you said, at times of
And
crisis, when people lose their marbles and they get more focused on Book of Revelations than actually being good humans, the words of Jesus don't mean anything to Christians anymore. It's quite startling.
yeah, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Like people don't want to hear that. Like the Beatitudes, like just the basic, like directly from Jesus's mouth, like all just the basic, like most important points. They don't want to hear that. And yeah, it's quite shocking to see how few, or at least in the discourse, so many people are yeah, they've just become like rabid. There's a bloodlust, right? Like they don't even know what this war is really about. Like the goals, nobody knows. There are no clear goals other than what, destroy another civilization that's been around for 3,000 years so you can take their oil. Like what? It's bloodlust, right? People are, again, Tim Dillon was saying, like people see explosions, they see they see action and stuff, and they're just sitting back and they love it. And so yeah, it's kind of like the Roman kind of Colosseum, like they're just taking joy in the destruction and the killing, which they think is all virtuous. And the Pete Hegseth, right? There's a lot more of these people, unfortunately, than is comfortable kind of admitting, where that's another thing for the spiritual question. You have a lot of people, why do they like turn to God or become spiritual? And like for Pete Hegseth, 2017, there was a story, he was accused of raping somebody, and like a year or two later he becomes a Catholic or whatever he is. That happens a lot too. So a lot of people, they don't necessarily take the paths or make the decisions that they're making for the right reasons, but it's actually because they're they're kind of demons and they know it, and they're like, I need something, but they don't do the real work, right? They don't observe the teachings of Jesus or whatnot. And so they just transpose all that craziness into their sort of spiritual outlook. And yeah, it's just one of kind of bloodlust, chaos, and it's just, yeah, it's just vicious. It's evil, right? So they've kind of, it's the devil's path, which they've convinced themselves is a pious thing. So yeah, there's a, I think that's where people have to be honest with themselves. Like, why are they making the decisions that they're making? A lot of people don't go to religion, because they want to go be good people. They have other motives, and they're lying to themselves, and that's the real sin. Like, they're okay. Everybody's told lies or whatnot, but they're lying to themselves. They're just like depriving themselves of the only thing that could heal them and bring them to something else and change them. They refuse that. So yeah,
Monty,
not Jesus's teachings, not.
yo, yo. Monty.
Yes, thank you very much, David. Yeah, well, the oracles seem to be working overtime these days in bringing about these strange stories to try to work us down some path. I think it was not by accident that Netanyahu yesterday just made the illusion that Genghis Khan was greater than Jesus Christ. And that's the kind of time we're in right now. But I have a question for you, but I'd like to set the stage for this question. It's the case that there are 4,500 Marine Expeditionary Forces being sent from Okinawa and San Diego to the Middle East as we speak, presumably for a ground invasion. And it is the case that nowhere in our recent history has there been a successful overthrow of a regime as they're likened to do in Iran with air power itself. It just doesn't happen. So it would require on the ground forces to accomplish this. But the fact of the matter is also it would take at least 3 million US forces to do this. And 4,500 is ridiculous. So it begs the question, why are they being sent? And in my mind, what I'm seeing is this is not being addressed. It just seems too fantastic. But in my mind, to send 4,500 Marines to take over an island or to try to invade Iran is just ridiculous. And it begs the question for me, insofar as the possibility that these people are being sent as part of a human sacrifice. In other words, there isn't the penchant for a war in the United States right now. I mean, it's very unpopular. So they got to have something to push this over the top. In other words, to just enrage people. And in that respect, I'm wondering, pre-Abrahamic religions, it was the case that, God ordained that there had to be sacrifices. I'm wondering if you could address this insofar as the time period you're addressing, whether this was a practice insofar as sacrificing people to enrage the population, to stir them up in order to get the ends they want, which is unthinkable right now. And so far as, well, for instance, just the last 2 days, there was attacks on nuclear power plants in both Iran and in Israel. So we're right on the verge of something unthinkable in that regard. So could you address this question insofar as ancient culture, the use of human sacrifice? Because I think that's what might be in play today in sending these men there, because it's impossible as far as a mission of what they're doing. It's just unthinkable. But would you address that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's like a ball thing, like, oh, we're going to sacrifice humans but the idea of using something, a mass casualty event to, further entangle the world in sort of a global conflagration. Yeah, I mean, that would probably make sense if you're a bad guy, right? And you're looking at the situation now. Yeah, and I mean, I just think about, again, the oracles, like even the thought that any of these things could be done, there's assessments, right? There are intelligence assessments, and much like the oracles, right? They give prophecies, they give forecasts. Today we have intelligence agencies. Their sources and methods are secret, right? So they're saying, oh, this is our assessment, this is what we think is going to happen. They give what information they want, right? And they leave out what information they want. So in that sense, yeah, nothing new under the sun, right? The way to manipulate public opinion or just the leadership in terms of giving them maybe half truths or just limiting the information and skewing it, just like the Apollo oracles did. I mean, that's kind of what the intelligence community is today, right? It's just, it has unlimited information, right? It knows what's happening on the ground everywhere. So they don't have really illusions about what things look like on the ground, but what they're saying is a different story. And yeah, getting a lot of people killed, and that makes sense. Yeah, mass casualty event, unfortunately. And so again, people, I mean, they should know this, right? They should know how these things work by now. And yeah, so that being said, the political debate is so polarized that's why I think it's important to zoom out as we are right now, right? And looking at ancient history and just getting people acquainted with the broader their story. That's also I think what's interesting and kind of exciting. Like, we're learning about ancient Greece and the oracles and all that, but it's also our story, right? It's the story of Western civilization. And so I think that's what people need, right? They need to know what their real story is and get in touch with that. And then they come to the current situation with a fresh pair of eyes. I think that's what's needed.
Can I share a couple of thoughts based on this? What you just said is dead on, spot on true. And I think that a big reason why we've fallen into these traps that we've been dumb enough to fall into, as far as unnecessary wars that we haven't seen even the tip of the iceberg if this goes southward, has a lot to do with our having been cut off, like you just said, from our having a direct relationship from these beautiful, deep traditions that have been severed. And without that anchoring with this wonderful heritage and this struggle against evil that is our sort of it's our right to be able to tap into that, because that's what brought us here. But without that, we lose the ability to discern, to use judgment, to discover who we are and form identities that are substantial, unless we become easily persuaded by false lines of sophistry that get us to become weaponized against ourselves as well as other people who we shouldn't be going to war with. And I was thinking about the similarities to the First Crusade back in 1095 when Urban II launched it, and it was largely being done and informed by end times prophecies. There's a lot of parallels to what we're currently sitting on the precipice of today, right? In terms of you had Sibylline oracles, Christianized, of course, but still Sibylline oracles that were rebranded, that were being used by the highest geopolitical game masters of the day 1,000 years ago, based upon forecasting end times moments. And there was a society that was losing its head. There was rampant plagues that had decimated whole swaths of the population of Europe for decades and decades leading up to that First Crusade. So they were increasingly normalizing death. They had a state of despair. The economy was in turmoil. They didn't have a sense of the future. And you had these Sibylline believers and policymakers around Urban II, trying to say, well, let's revitalize things and direct people's energy towards a cause that but it wasn't very popular. The idea of going off to some foreign land, people hadn't really left their little, plantation area for forever, their whole lives. So the idea of going off to Africa or to the Middle East to go and fight for abstract ideas like taking back Jerusalem was a very, very abstract. Nobody really wanted to do that. But by creating the First Crusade in 1096 was a total failure. Like, because it came in several waves. It was considered a success in 1098 when Jerusalem was taken. But there were several waves before that that needed to happen. The first one was 40,000. It was called the Peasants' Crusade, and 40,000 people, lower houses of nobility, right, disposable, overpopulated, uh, human property of those noble houses were organized to go and basically be underprepared, under-equipped, and just go to war. And they got completely annihilated. And that mass murder of these people who just walked into death. They weren't prepared. They were promised all sorts of golden ages that would emerge if they just like do what leader says. What Peter the Hermit was like, one of these prophets was leading the way. Just do what he says, and you'll have a golden age. Things will just fall into place, And that didn't happen. But then the psychological consequences of that on the rest of the European population of seeing or hearing that 40,000 of their fellow Europeans, mostly Franks and Normans, were wiped out, created a propaganda mechanism like a Pearl Harbor moment where people were like, okay, well, now we have to get revenge. And that created the impetus for the second wave that was much more brutal, much more well organized in a sense. But that first one, whether it was just simply a geopolitically expedient mass casualty event like a 9/11 or whatever, or whether it was also accompanied with a concept of human sacrifice, like Monty just pointed out, maybe both can be true at the same time. It definitely had the effect of getting people to acquiesce to something that was formerly unthinkable. So yeah, I could see today clearly those parallels again, right? Yeah, it's a bit jarring, and there's many more examples like that too. So I just want to share that.
Oh yeah, that's useful. And I mean, what a bad reflex. So it's like, well, maybe our leadership isn't good if so many people are getting killed. Like maybe our decisions aren't good. Like doubling down and just doubling down. I mean, there's many examples in history where that's just, if the leadership isn't being questioned and the strategy, I mean, again, people's minds, if they're just emotional crowds, it's a shame, but that's all the more very important. These are very important conversations to be having right now, and giving people a way out, right? Spiritually and intellectually, like an off ramp. People do need that.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you a question about where you see the manifestation of this ancient oracular system of prophets and what have you, and oracles today. I was thinking about Oracle AI and these things, but
Right.
maybe I also feel like maybe I should just wait for your videos to come out. I don't know. Do you want to speak to that at all? Or?
Well, just a little teaser, right? Because I mean, we're going to go into the Enlightenment. One of the big paradoxes that we're going to have to untangle is the emergence of science, modern science, the Renaissance, and how all that got very confused with the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is one of, I think, these modern sacred myths about like how Western civilization became what it is. We had this thing called the Enlightenment. And that's a very interesting period that, I mean, people really seem to not understand, because it's all about methodology, like the battle about knowledge and accessing knowledge, making discoveries, understanding the nature of the divine and how we split things up, the spiritual and the material. That all goes back to the Enlightenment. And that's where most of the confusion comes from. And that's where we have these radical dualities today, where the people that are very religious are usually are often very crazy, like they don't believe in rationality, and then the people who are hyper rational are often very crazy because they don't believe in kind of any immaterial causes, or kind of anything that they can't quantify or measure doesn't really have any role or impact in shaping their lives and behavior on like a day to day and just like on the scale of their entire life. They have trouble reconciling the material and immaterial. So that also goes back to a Manichaean cult. So that was kind of revived with the Enlightenment. So we're going to go there. We're really going to destroy some sacred myths. And I'd say that's what, just like the ancient priesthoods, we have all these myths about like how the universe works, right? The Big Bang, the this, the that. And you know, there's not that much science behind these theories, but there's consensus, there's experts, and yeah, there's a high priesthood in science, there's a high priesthood in academia. We're it's quite stunning to the degree that, you know, I feel like I've had a few conversations with people who are smart and they don't get this idea of there being like two sets of education, in the same way that in the ancient times, right, the priesthood, in order to guard sacred knowledge, there were different kinds of education for different people. There were different paths. There was a reason for that. They have trouble seeing how that's still a thing today, especially with like modern academia and science and all that. But it very much is. And like people just don't know how to think about that. So we are going to get into that, and that's definitely going to take us deeper into the question of mystery, right, in terms of how all this works and understanding the mechanisms as well.
Are you going to go into the Rosicrucian aspect of the Enlightenment of John Dee and the scryers and oracles around him and Bacon, or yeah?
Well, the second part will, but then clearly there could be a whole film kind of dedicated to just surveying that whole period a lot more, which would probably be very cool because people don't know much, but there are some very interesting characters, right? John Dee, Bacon, like they're very interesting characters, right? They're not stupid people. So I think, yeah, it's actually useful. That's another thing technically. A lot of people, especially again, if there's this kind of religious lens, they tend to both, Matt, as you observe, like they give the bad guys too much credit, and at the same time they also underestimate the bad guys. They're doing both, right? Like they're, some of these operators are very intelligent, right, and they deserve a certain amount of credit in terms of like understanding how they're thinking and how they're navigating things. And people don't understand that, right? They don't understand the thinking process for these higher level Rosicrucians and Luciferians. They don't understand the methodology. And if they did, it would really demystify a lot, right? About politics, about science, about education. And then the real mysteries would emerge in their proper place instead of all this kind of like occult, you know, hullabaloo. So yeah, and at the same time, the bad guys are also not that smart, you know, in terms of certain ideas that they just can't accept, which are true and which are kind of like at the core of what is the best of Western civilization, that they just fundamentally reject. And so when we understand those as well, that gives us a certain power that we didn't know we had, because we were just not, we weren't familiar with the actual story and the methodologies that made these things possible.
Well said. Kelly.
Hi, Dave. Question about astrology.
I'm a Capricorn.
Yeah, so am I, by the way. I guess that's where the wisdom comes from, or the there's another quality. What's the other quality? Level-headed. Level-headedness. Anyways, astrology. That goes way back to Mesopotamian days. I have no idea like how they actually practiced it and that. Over the centuries, like nowadays, it's, you know, horoscopes and we don't even know why. Like we don't even know why. We just, you know, you go in the newspaper or and it says, you know, what your day is going to be, but there was no science behind it. At least there seems to be no science, but somewhere along the line in the past, somebody had to figure that out. But it kind of got, now it's just a mystery. What's your views on all that?
Well, that kind of reminds me that I should probably, that's another installment in the series right there, just in terms of the Renaissance, the transition. If you've read like what's her name, Frances Yates, or like this is a fun book, Pagan Mysteries in the Renaissance, Orphic Mysteries, and all that, which uh, Frances she bases some of her research on earlier research from a few of these guys. So I read the people that some of the folks that she was reading, and they just talk about they're very interested in the development of science dating back to the Renaissance. That's always, it's a, endlessly fascinating topic because these are all occultist researchers and scholars, like the top ones. Like they're very smart and they're doing some very fascinating work, and they're all very fascinated by how science emerged, and they come up with these interesting narratives that are kind of deceptive and at the same time insightful about how magic and like quantitative and qualitative sciences, so astrology would have been considered a qualitative science that was still believed, kind of adhered to even in the Renaissance, but then there were changes where like you're still using measurements of the stars, right? You're still using, you still have a method for measuring phenomena, but then their methodology, what they do with it, that's where it's like, well, it's not really science, right? It's not really sound or based on reason. And this is, you get this with Bacon and John Dee and all these guys. Like they understand mathematics, science. Paolo Sarpi, like Paolo Sarpi was like the best mathematician, or what considered like the greatest mathematician of in his lifetime, of all, with everything going on. So yeah, magic and science have this interesting history that confuses people as much as it sort of offers some insights. So that's definitely something we're going to flesh out in I put out a trailer for the Secrets of the Renaissance. So that's going to get us into Hermeticism and the Prisca Theologia. So the kind of, this is where the mystery cults are being reconstituted into something a bit more sophisticated, maybe a bit more modern, with Neoplatonism, and again another sacred narrative. The role of, like, how did the Renaissance really happen? We have a lot of this kind of Neoplatonic jargon and about like art and eros, and like the human form, and like Renaissance being about man versus the medieval ages being about God, and how that's reflected in the art, and how science plays into all that. So yeah, that's definitely going to be some those will be some future installments, but hopefully that gives at least a few clues in terms of how what I'm looking at and what the bad guys were kind of, how they're thinking about that as well.
Do you know how the I feel like these questions are so massive, and I feel like I should just wait. But in your research, you mentioned the Prisca Theologia. I didn't look into that. Is that the sort of movement that generated the Neoplatonic fervor in the Renaissance period, or what is that?
Well, it played into it in a sense. Prisca Theologia is the like the pure theologians, and so just the line from like, there are these like the eminent theologians and thinkers, from Pythagoras to Zoroastrius to Hermes Trismegistus to Moses, right, to Jesus. And so they build out this line, this continuity of the ideas, where, in the same way Schiller's talking about Moses and how, Mosaic law and Judaism, sort of how Christianity, developed among those currents as well. They do that, but infusing the mystery cults into that tradition. Kabbalah, that's where Kabbalah was reintroduced. Yeah, with Piero della Mirandola. He's the first guy who was like, Kabbalah proves the truth of Christianity, and it's all about reading the sort of Hebrew letters and like finding the name of Jesus in it. Like it's a bit basic or elementary compared to what Kabbalah became after, but he was one of the first to really introduce Kabbalah into, you know, to the popes and into the church during the Renaissance, because there was an opening up, right? I think that's what people get wrong. And some people, they see that all these bad things came out of the Renaissance, so they think it's bad. But it's because there was an opening up. So the door to all sorts of things was open at the same time. And so if we can't determine which currents are what, obviously we're just kind of going to oversimplify things. And that's what most people do. But then they lose the track of like, well, how did we even get modern civilization then? Like, how did we ever break away from the system of mystery cults? Or, you know, they're still around. Have we broken away? Or is our failure to fully understand that history, you know, part of why, you know, we haven't? So the Renaissance is a good inflection point because it's also opens the door to the modern world, but it also opens the door to the Rosicrucianism and the new sophisticated forms of mystery cults that had to adapt to the changes, right? To the discovery of like modern scientific methodology. That's ultimately what Rosicrucians and stuff, like they're all very mindful of that and how they're developing their educational institutions, right? And their brands of education. You know, and fast forward today, we have things like DARPA, we have all these top secret, you know, weapons programs and energy programs. You know, there are people who are still have a lot of initiative and creativity that are working in kind of separate projects. But how are they found? You know, they're recruited through universities, they're recruited through research projects and stuff. So yeah, this gets us to opens a whole can of worms, right? So yeah, these are all films in the making. You know, it's just a question of time and resources for people who want. I mean, all this is, if I hadn't done 5 years of research, which is what went into this book, I wouldn't be able to do this series. It's kind of upsetting that it's taken this long to, you know, start churning out the films and bringing everything together. But yeah, get the book if people are interested in kind of long form breakdown of a lot of these developments. And then the films are just going to continue to add. So yeah, there's just going to constantly be new stuff, but also just clarifying the things that most people are still very confused about in terms of our history. And that's why we're yeah, there's so much confusion today.
Last chance for anybody who has a question to get it off their chest. Well, JD Tippett is, I guess, in the chat box, JD is asking, doesn't it, and I suppose that's reference to the Kabbalah, invoke some special knowledge?
I was referring to the Prisca Theologia, just in the sense it like implies I've got some special knowledge.
Yeah, it's handed down because there's an oral tradition, right? So the whole idea is that Moses had the written laws, but then there was also an oral tradition, and you know, Paul was privy to the oral tradition, and this oral tradition has been carried down. And yeah, this is where you get into Freemasonry, right, as well, like Sufis as well, and you know, they know the true meanings of certain symbols, and it's all mystery is really even in like modern psychology, neuro-linguistic programming, and all business, like a lot of it is about mystery, right? If you want people to break profile, you have to promise them something that will change them, that will blow their mind, that they're not even able to imagine. But if they're willing to, you know, go through certain stages, technically some of these things are good instincts, right? The mystery cults are tapping into a healthy instinct, but very quickly, you know, taking it somewhere else, right? Just like the child that's curious, that's a good thing, but you can easily do a lot of harm, by manipulating that curiosity. And that's what the mystery cults are good at. So they've really, as history has evolved, they've had to evolve. And I think that's what people don't get. But that also means they need to evolve. Like, we need to evolve. Western civilization has evolved. Traditions, if they're not dead, are developing, right? So people have this kind of weird idea of tradition as just something in the past. And like, that's kind of, conservatism today, politically or spiritually, is just very much trying to preserve something from the past, but there's no life in it. There's no living tradition today. There's no creativity. So it's hard to preserve something if you can't actually contribute anything to it or use it to create anything new and good. So yeah, the mysteries are immense.
Yeah, I was thinking about the sloppiness of it with my experience in art school, how we were in university, in fine arts, people were encouraged to skip the step of discovering the techniques of the masters of the past. None of that was actually looked down upon. If anybody wanted to do that, they got no respect. And people were encouraged to immediately, the students were rewarded for just expressing their emotions in the most novel way possible. That's what got rewarded, but there was no real understanding of what were the principles you were acting upon, what actually was this historic tradition and method that allowed for these developments and discoveries of linear perspective and all of these, the chiaroscuro and all of the real discoveries, right? That were improved upon in time. That was just completely severed, and people were told, be novel, be creative, but without knowledge. And then there was a parallel movement that I noticed that's been growing as well, of a conservative backlash, where there is a sort of classical renewal movement within the arts, people who are disgusted by this arbitrary cult of novelty, that are trying to, and it's healthy that you see that there's this effort to try to reclaim or rediscover the traditions of, but at the same time, it's contaminated by this rigidity. Like you were saying, there's this idea of painting literal realism to a, and there's no real space for the mind to think about, well, how did Rembrandt communicate ironies in how he framed his selection of imagery within his paintings, or his choices to paint a certain myth, whether from a story from the Bible or a Greek or Roman myth, or a historic painting. Like, nobody's thinking about the actual role of what's beyond the literal image of the frame in this hyper realistic banality. And then it becomes this weird dispute between, like, do you want to just be an unreasonable, emotional libertine who's gonna, just express themselves, but without any tyranny of reason, of thought? Or do you want to be somebody who is honoring the traditions, but with no emotion, like no spiritual freedom whatsoever? It's suffocating, and it's a false debate of who's
Or
better.
even in both cases, though, there's not real development either,
Mm.
right? Like, the other one is skipping too many steps in terms of just emotions, where you can't develop an idea or develop a method if you're just kind of going at it from pure impulse and like spontaneity. But as well, for the traditional ideas, again, people think like tradition is this static thing, and they don't see that the traditions develop. Like, the tradition that is Christianity over 1,000 years underwent many developments and changes. And obviously the official narrative, which is fine, like there's a purpose for that as well, is that, there is this one tradition, but you can learn that throughout history there was evolution and development. And when people lose the ability to think in those kind of dynamic ways, they can't make new discoveries, right? And they can't advance. They say they're spiritual, but they're not really advancing spiritually, because they're just trying to recapture something in the past. But they don't realize that any times these traditions were truly alive, there was like a fire of authenticity, and there was a development, right? Like, for a long time, the Christians were just kind of trying to preserve the teachings and the schooling and the church, but they had to do all sorts of things to do that, because you had all these gnostic cults and kind of imperial machinations. So like you had to be very creative, right? The church fathers were very creative in their polemics, but today it's kind of just this kind of dry defense of, again, the past, but it doesn't really have much life to it. So I do think, again, in the same way, the real bad guys have been able to evolve, but they had to evolve because there were positive major developments in history. We have to be able to do that as well, and it seems like most people are unwilling because they have this very fixed idea of everything. So here we are reacquainting ourselves, going back to basics.
When in crisis, go back to the basics. Jerry, I'm going to give you the last question.
Okay there. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, good. Hi, Dave.
Hi.
I just had one question, because when Matt was talking there, it popped back into my head, something you had said earlier. Because when you were talking about the mysteries and that, you said people have to do the work. And I thought, today I've talked to a number of people. Most people don't do the work. That's their problem. And so I wanted to ask you your idea. Why don't people want to do the work? Why do they just accept what's handed to them? Because that's how they get trapped into a lot of this nonsense. But anyway, I'd like your comment on what you think is our problem today. Why we don't want, are we just too lazy? Are we afraid of the unknown, of doing the work? Anyway, whatever you think, Dave, I'd like your comment.
Well, to be fair, as one of the first quotes in the film, right? Beware of unearned wisdom, which is not a bad one. I mean, it's Carl Jung. We know he's kind of a super sketchy occultist guy, but I mean, again, wisdom is wisdom, and it's not a bad it's not a bad reminder. Beware of unearned wisdom. That's kind of Schiller's, the first, again, for people who haven't seen, right? This is technically part 2. The first film, Reclaiming the Mysteries, has been out for a while. I have a remastered version on Age of Muses for anyone who hasn't seen it. And that's where we open with, we use Schiller's poem, The Veiled Image at Sais, where the young acolyte of the Egyptian priesthood kind of skips steps, right? And he runs into some serious problems as a result. So yeah, people need to do the work for sure. At the same time, like, people are kind of busy, right? People are overwhelmed with so much. Like, I've had to jump through so many hoops and be super flexible and do so many things that I couldn't expect somebody who has a 9-to-5 job to do, right? And to deal with that level of uncertainty and bouncing around and, having to come up with some new, doing something new to just keep everything going, so that I can keep pursuing the projects. But I mean, that's why it's useful when you have communities, right? So people are at different levels, but also that's why I'm making the films, because people do need to do the work, but we also want to present things in a way that is accessible and sets the right tone and pace for people to then sort of jump on board, right? If it's a fast moving train and there's all this stuff, waiting for them. But I mean, if it's moving too fast or whatnot, or you got to get on at the right time or at the right station. So I do feel like part of, my job now is having jumped through all these hoops and acquired, certain knowledge that is not taught in school, and the chances of you kind of coming to it, if you haven't gone down, a lot of winding roads, is very faint. So how to bring it together now in a way that is also leisure, right? Because education back in the days, like when you would cultivate yourself, the liberal arts, it was a luxury, right? It was something that you could study literature, you could study these things if you had the privilege or the time. So making that fun again as well, so that then you are inspired, and maybe you won't read all of Plato's dialogues, but you'll start by reading one or two, right? And it's going to start to become part of you, and that's going to have an effect on your interactions and communities as well. So yeah, I think they're part of the problem is obviously people have become anesthetized, they're demoralized, and they've just been brainwashed, right? If they would have gotten this stuff in school, we wouldn't be having this conversation, would we? But since they're not, I mean, they've done a lot of work that they'd have to realize that they're going to have to unlearn, right? So like unlearning is harder than learning. And so for a lot of people that would have to do the work, they would have to, there's already a lot of baggage, I'd say. And so it wouldn't be about just doing new work, but having to undo and unlearn a lot of stuff, so that they can come to these questions and discussions that we're having, with a fresh mind. So I think it's challenging, but that's why I think films and innovative ways of getting people exposure to these ideas, because now education is becoming more decentralized. Like a lot of people are looking for alternative ways to educate themselves, right? A lot of people are educating themselves through podcasts, audio books or whatnot. There's just a lot of new avenues that I think people are exploring. So I don't think we're in a bad time, right? Where people can once again rediscover that, hey, like the real thing can be pursued. You'll have to do the work, but at least you have a sense of, some of the mystery that's waiting for you on the other side if you're willing to, take that deep dive. And it's definitely worth it, especially as everything people thought was true or permanent is now kind of crashing down. Yeah, definitely an important time for these reminders. Fret not. Fret a little bit, but not too much.
Fret a little bit, but not too much. I like that. No, Dave, this is really good. And the links to your work, your Substack, your excellent Substack that I encourage everybody to subscribe to get the paid upgrade for the a lot of your stuff is free, but a lot of it isn't. So that as well, when movies come out that you make, that's behind a paywall. So if people support you on a monthly or a yearly basis, they'll be able to get quick access to all of those things, plus links to your book to access the extraordinarily important resource there. That'll be all in the description box under this video once it's up online. Hopefully by the time it's up online, the film itself will be ready to view. If so, then that link will also be in the description box. And I'd say also, just Dave, the fact that you're drawing as well from Schiller and his Mission of Moses study is so important, for giving people I think a strong sense, a strong hypothesis from one of the highest quality minds ever produced from the human species, who have really grappled with this topic in a serious way and analyzed how these mysteries became corrupted in time, and what was this quality of corruption that resulted in the mystery schools generating this gnostic esoteric sort of perversion of itself as societies decayed at moments of crisis, and what did Moses do battle with. So I'm looking forward to the continuation of that story in part 2 of your film series. That's coming.
We're gonna come out punching, so it's gonna be fun.
Well, I'm going to include a link to Schiller's Mission of Moses and his other universal history lectures too, that are really worth taking the time, along with Plato's dialogues, to just sit down in our time of crisis and really get some real substance that you can hold on to, and that you can practically use these techniques of thought and analysis in the world you live in. It's not just an ivory tower exercise in philosophy, and then you have reality as something totally different. These are practicable skill sets that can be drawn from for anybody doing this with an honest heart. So thank you, Dave, for awakening that flame, and I'm hoping a greater number of people who really do need to have that flame awoken to do the heavier lifting And thank you everybody for taking part.
One last thing I will say, because I could work on these things nonstop. So for people who are interested, we do want executive producers, people who want to help fund the films. Like, this is working on this film is this is all I've been doing for the last month. So a lot of the timing for how fast and frequently these films will come out depends on resources and time there. So if people want to become executive producers, just become a founding member of Age of Muses, and we'll put your name in the next film as well as the executive producer. And if we can get a couple of those, I mean, these films, again, our discussion, I think, has made clear that there's a whole 1,000 hours waiting to be produced. So I'm game. And it's just a question of how much time and resources I can afford. Otherwise, I'm just jumping through hoops. And so, yeah, for those who are able, consider it. But yeah, this thing is coming out in 2 parts. And again, it's nonstop. So it should be out soon. So I do look forward to seeing what people think.